Hi everyone, I am Veronica Schmitt. The question that I have for you today is, do you see it coming? Have you built in observability? No, I don't need an answer to that question yet, but I want you to ponder upon that as the talk continues. Now, who am I? I'm an assistant professor at Norway University in Norway. I teach medical device forensics as one of my specialties, but generally teaching in the realm of digital forensics and incident response. I also work with an amazing team at Medtronic in the United States, specifically the cardiac rhythm management team. I am a cyborg, and buy me a coffee and I'll tell you that story. But I've been a DFIR professional for more than 10 years, as well as a medical device hacker and forensicator and incident responder. Now, I'm also a mom to two little forensicators and hackers, and I developed the 5 log philosophies. So let's get started. Why is medical devices such a big thing? Why do we care? Well, recent statistics showed that in the United States, 3 to 6 network medical devices are next to each patient's bed. Now, if you do the sums in that, that is quite a lot of network medical devices. Now, why do I care? Because for the last 5 years, I've been eating, breathing, and living medical devices. Well, I've had one beating my heart since the age of 19. I am on device 4. I have had failures, rejections, and therapy changes. Ask me, I've had them all. In May, I recently had a full rewire device and firmware update, so now I'm proudly a Cyborg 2.0. So you might say that this is very close to my heart and I've got skin in the game. Now, I always have a saying, with great technology comes great responsibility to protect it. But if I ask you the question, do we have enough information to detect whether or not a device has been breached? We've all seen the vulnerabilities, but the question remains, do we know whether they've been exploited in the wild? Now, that's a very hard question for me to answer because it depends on the device, but most likely not yet. We're not yet robustly and actively looking for those threats on medical devices. Now, I'm going to say to you, all medical devices aren't designed equal. They're not the same. They might be classified as a medical device, but they're not the same. There's apples, there's pears and lemons. They all differ. Now, according to the FDA, as well as European guidelines, there are 3 types of medical devices. There are active medical devices. So these are generally your patient monitors, your MRI machine, and devices that aren't implanted in a human being. Then you get your category of active implanted medical devices. Now, those might be devices such as diabetes monitors, deep brain stimulators, gastrointestinal stimulators, as well as cardiac implants. So these 2 are very different in what they do and what hardware, software, and operating systems they run. Lastly, you get your diagnostic medical devices, and yes, you might not believe it, but in vitro swabs and specimen examination trays are considered to be a medical device. For the purpose of this talk, we will be focusing on the first 2 and not the last one. This was kind of just some background to understand what kind of medical devices are out there. Now, these are further then classified according to the FDA in terms of high risk and low risk. So high risk is more those that are implanted in the body, but which are life-sustaining. And this is kind of the process it goes through the FDA when it gets to approvals. And these approvals might be different based upon the geographical regions. The US is different from Australia, New Zealand, and the EU region, and the UK. So it kind of depends on the region you are doing digital forensics in. Now, let's simplify it a little bit, because those, according to me, can get a little bit convoluted and confusing. We have an implant. That implant has a programmer. That programmer has an application on it. It has an operating system and it contains hardware. So the only one that is perhaps a little bit strange is the implant and the programmer. But in digital forensics, we know all about applications, we know about different operating systems, and we understand hardware. So 3 out of the 5 medical components that we might encounter, we actually do understand as digital forensic practitioners. Now let's break it down a little bit more. Now your implants will often have an embedded OS or have no OS at all, and is more in terms of what we would encounter during memory forensics, a set of memory addresses that runs on low energy. So if you break it down and simplify things, you understand that these devices are as smart as they are clinically, hardware level, as well as what information it contains, is perhaps a little bit dumber than what we're used to. Now, the programmer often runs Windows, Linux, Android, or another embedded operating system. I've encountered them on all of these. They range from Windows XP throughout to Windows 95 to Windows 10 kiosk, as well as running Android or various variants of Linux. Now, again, this might seem like it is oversimplified, but I promise you, when you start opening these devices and start, getting to know them, that it's things we've encountered just in a different format. Now, the applications that connect to these programmers and allow the communication between the implant and the programmer often is a mobile application, or one that's a desktop or even tablet-based. Now, there's a huge variety because it depends on the use cases, it depends on the manufacturer, and it depends on the geographical area. Now, operating systems you might find embedded, such as VxWorks, iOS, Windows, and Android. So if you've been around in digital forensics for more than, let's say, a decade, just, get ready to brush off those Windows 95 and Windows XP skills. Now, the hardware is a little bit complicated because that really depends on each manufacturer. And that kind of, you have to have the device in your hand. So it's not as easy just to simplify that up. But the rest of the components all contain logs. Now, on the vulnerable side of things, we need to become comfortable with the fact that at some point, a medical device will be vulnerable in its lifetime. And there's various reasons for that. Now, some of the things you might find is IV pumps that have, contain 38% of the typical footprint in a hospital. However, in the latest years, they have had 73% of the vulnerabilities that have been disclosed. Now, these are various vulnerabilities from high risk to low risk, but they make up a large proportion. And that could typically be because they are so important within the hospital ecosystem. Now, you get something which is called capital equipment, which is equipment that hospitals lease. This is your MRI machines and your very expensive medical devices. Your programmers that program the implants are often also capital equipment. Now, these can run Windows 10, or they might only run Windows XP. And the reason being is that they are around for 10 plus years, and the hardware simply doesn't support this OS to be updated. Now, default passwords remain a problem in this space. It's one that we encounter often in the logs, I might add. They might be base64 encrypted, and they might be just logged in clear text. As I said before, these devices are made to last for many years. I kind of realize with every vulnerability that all roads lead to the logs. But as much as the logs is for good, as we use them in digital forensics, they are the double-edged lightsaber of the world when it comes to medical devices. Because as much as we want all the information to be logged, so does attackers. Because if you have physical access to a medical device, you could potentially have the keys to the kingdom just one log away. So let's talk a little bit about what I mean from the log side of things from a medical device manufacturer perspective. And don't think corporate. Don't at all think corporate. Think product logs. Now, when I say product logs, I refer to those that are contained on the application as well as on the devices themselves. So it's not your traditional logs as we might think of in digital forensics. This is not a corporate logs, and it's often not architecture logs. So now the question is, why do we log on these devices? I have just told you that this is a double-edged sword, where there are use cases for this. One being developers need to know that everything is functioning as it should. The engineers want to know that it is running as it should, it's operating as it should. And if there is a problem that is raised, a problem in the field, they can then address it and do their own incident response. I think coming into medical devices, the one thing that I realized is that developers do a large portion of the incident response. It's just a slightly different perspective. They are debugging and solving client issues that are occurring during the use of the device. Business wants to know how the devices are functioning. They want to know how many is out there, what their return on investment is, and they want to see metrics in terms of performance. Specifically, as we update these devices and update the software on it, the performance might start lacking because the hardware can no longer support the software that's run on it. Now, security professionals or DFIR people, we want to see what's going on, whether we are being actively attacked. We want to know what our normal is so we can spot the abnormal. We want to early on detect that these devices are being targeted and understand how these weaknesses are exploited. Now, the question I asked all the developers 3 years ago is your logs designed for observability? Do you know whether or not your devices are being actively targeted, whether or not there is any exploitation of any kind? It's one thing to have vulnerabilities that have been disclosed in a controlled environment by researchers, which is, it's God's work being done there. We need to know what's broken. But we do not know if any of those have actively been exploited. Now, I want to make it clear, medical devices are built for the purpose of being a life-saving, life-sustaining device. They are not made to be a security device. And we need to understand that requirement very carefully. That does not mean that they should be unsecure, but it is unfortunately part of the world we're moving. These devices last for long. The hardware cannot sustain all the latest security updates for that extended time. So at one point, it will become vulnerable. I always find this very funny when I do digital forensics and incident response. And I say to them, when last did you have a look at your log? When last did you actually clean your log? What use is a log if we never look at that? So it's one thing to have information contained in a log on a device, but if you never ingest that into a central repository and actually actively look at them, they aren't useful at all. We cannot be reactive and constantly want to go back and look at logs once we have a disclosure or someone has let us know there's a problem. And I think this is the biggest thing that we're struggling with, is how do we become more reactive versus proactive? Now the logs are perfect. I know exactly what has happened, said no incident responder ever. After joining Medtronic as an independent researcher and looking at logs on various medical devices, not just theirs, I soon realized that these logs were not made or fit to made for purpose to actually do incident response and early detection. They were designed by developers for developers and didn't include the security things we needed. So I went back to the beginning, because often that is where a story is rewritten. And that was the design of the logs. So working with the developers, we read a book called The Unicorn Project and the Phoenix Project that talks about the simple 5 philosophies. And we've translated that over into how you can actually look at log design. You should keep it simple, structured, and detailed enough. You should tag it and use that metadata. Create what is not there. Keep it clean and focused. We all know security debt and know it's a problem. But did you know that you can, accumulate that within your logs? Assume that at some point you will be compromised and make sure that you log accordingly. Do not live in the philosophy that you will not get attacked. If you assume that you've already been attacked or will be attacked, you'll be able to log appropriately. Consider who has access to the logs and how they are stored and how they are transported. So these are the 5 philosophies at a minimum that the developers work with. How do I furthermore teach them that it's important? Well, we designed a tool. We derived it from the MDS Square, which is a manufacturer disclosure statement for medical devices that is filled out. That contains a lot of information related to the medical device's security. Now, this is based upon NIST and various other regulations. So we designed the logging benchmark project. We used the funnel approach by looking at regulations that deal with logging and deal with incident response. We found best practices by looking at OWASP and the various projects that they have there. And then good old-fashioned experience that has been brought from various developers and myself. So we designed a tool that we are able to know what our problems are, identify them, and fix them. Now, if you think about it, we needed to measure where our legacy, device logs lie. Are they mature? Are they completely, unmature? And the reason we wanted a maturity scoring is we needed a baseline to work from. We needed to know where we were going, where we are, and how we get to where we want to be, which is mature logs. Now, one of my colleagues that works with me often states, we do not want a data swamp. We want a data lake that contains good logs. So this tool allows us to have controls that have specific events underneath them, which we can measure to see whether or not we can find that in the logs. The teams often do it, and we come to the same conclusion. This is an example. We set a target, we move to where we want to be in terms of the various events under each of these categories, and we receive an actual score. And this score can be done through various iterations within the development process to make sure that we're moving towards more robust logs. Now, the logs, as I said, is a double-edged sword. Now, you might wonder exactly what do I mean with that? Well, often when I do analysis of logs, we find that there are things that people have forgotten about. Now, developers move in a general 2-week cycle of developments, which are called sprints. Now, in these sprints, new features are introduced, updates are done, changes are made. Now, often logs contain information that should be only in debugging and shouldn't be within the logs, and they have been forgotten. So actively doing a log analysis and actively cleaning them with the development team that designs the device, designs the application, allows you to actually not have these common mistakes in your logs. You might leave app keys and secrets, which is like the username and password on your general machine. You might actually leave certificates. Now, generally, we do not want to see these in because it's a hygiene issue as much as it is a security issue. JWT tokens is often forgotten, and they come from response bodies or the printf statement. As a digital forensics and incident responder, the printf statement has become my enemy in terms of log design. It's often where mistakes happen. Events that are not marked appropriately as debug events, but information level events that sneak into your logs. These are common mistakes that all organizations make. I have looked at not only one manufacturer, but other devices as well, and they suffer from the same problem. We have designed the logs, but we haven't taken security in mind. Now, why did I go back to the developers and not just try and fix it the old-fashioned way? Well, it's easier to fix it at the start and draw a line in the sand and say, we're not going to pass this by old behaviors. Now, at Medtronic, I'm very proud to say they have set a standard for logs. They have set a standard for how logs are developed, as well as invested in educating developers in doing logs better. The belief is good quality logs equals good intelligence. Building good quality logs allows us to derive our normal to find our abnormal. It's probably one of the sayings I've taken for years from SANS is know your normal to know your abnormal. Once we have good baseline logs, we are able to detect when things go wrong and detect fast and respond appropriately. It's moving with a common goal as an organization. Now, if you've worked at a big organization, you realize that things move slower than normally. But having a common goal, which is good logs that allows the security team to have observability, allows them to actually move with one endpoint in mind. Large amounts of time are spent to educate the developers, to help them understand what security is looking for and forensics is looking for within their logs. Setting a standard when development starts allows you to control where the logs will end up. Also, building with the acceptance that at one point it will be compromised, but you will have ensured that you have the logs needed to detect and respond appropriately. Having common frameworks and outputs, which means a standard structure for the logs, as well as logging frameworks dependent on language. Thinking about the data and what you want from it and what you will do with it. A developer needs it for a various different reasons than a security practitioner or a business analyst would need it. We all look at the same data, but we need different things from it. Now, Medtronic has moved specifically in the product zone to think of logging as a feature versus just a byproduct of code. This means that we are busy developing software requirements that includes debugging metrics, how the system's performing, the clear workflow of what's happened, security and incident response. Now, setting requirements around logging is a fairly new thing to include different perspectives in one. And the teams that I've worked with has taken to this with a fish in water, and has embraced looking at the logs from a different set of eyes. Now, how do we know what to log? Well, we threat model, of course, but we use a different tool called cornucopia. Now, cornucopia allows developers to become hackers, and let me tell you, the most evil things come from the hands of a developer. When they've identified that there are specific threats that they cannot address or talk away, these items go onto a backlog, which allows them to further develop logging around that component. As I said before, vulnerabilities will be there. An attacker only needs one open window to compromise a system. Finding ways to set traps within your logs is hard. Knowing that you've been compromised is, the first part of the battle to be won. So allowing them to do an inverted stride using cornucopia allows them to think about how they potentially would compromise the system, allowing us to find problems during development versus after. Now, implantable devices, let's face it, you've only got X amount of CPU cycles. No patient wants to have frequent battery changes. I certainly do not. I do not want to do it every 3 years. I spoke to an engineer specifically on the implanted and embedded department, and I had a whole list of security things I wanted to have 3 years ago. He looked at me and he said to me, "So you want a new device every 3 years?" We have to acknowledge that the main thing that's important on this device is to keep our heart beating. But that doesn't mean logging is impossible. It means we have to think about it differently. Versus having a full forensic log, perhaps we can use it as a trigger device. A simplistic log that potentially tells us that something unfavorable has occurred, making it part of the workflow and thinking what would not form part of the workflow. Considering when the device operates, when it's running, and how it functions. Like, no security should be draining on the battery on these kinds of devices. Acknowledging what your security constraints are or your physical constraints allows you to creatively work on them. So thinking of implants as a signal that something's gone on is a good way to have a very simplistic logging on these devices. Now, the Locard principle is something we all know and love, but it's often not something we've designed or something we've built in it. It's a byproduct of how electronic systems function. But one of the things we've been trying to do is actually create in the ecosystem of medical devices, the built-in Locard principle. So fabricating the Locard principle, having the implant signal to the home monitor that there is a log that needs to be updated or that something has occurred. That being sent up to the mobile application and to the cloud solution. Or the other way, but building in the ability to form that chain of events is important. The Locard principle is one of the fundamentals that we follow in terms of building better logs across the ecosystem to have observability. So having triggers and traps that allow for the early detection. Now, we've come to the place where we have logs. What do we do with them? Well, there are some considerations when it comes to having logs. We might have situations where there's PHI and PII in. So steps should either be taken to anonymize or scrape it or redact it completely. You should consider that your logs is almost public information because at some point that physical device will not be in your possession, not be in your control. So my recommendation is always not to have PHI and PII. If you do, perhaps using an open source solution to do, your SIEM or your ingestion is not a good idea. Building a SIEM takes a village, and this is kind of where we are. It's very complicated. There's a lot of moving parts. There's a lot of items within the ecosystem. More importantly, you don't want to break a workflow and you don't want to cause a device to stop functioning. As I said, some of these are near and dear to someone's heart or brain, or it's what's keeping them alive. One of the things we've looked at is the ALK stack because it's very versatile. It allows us to build the SIEM we want. So watch this space because this is still work that's being done. It's still work that's being researched. But my dream is to build a medical SIEM, to have all those beautiful logs in our data lake ingested into one solution that we can monitor and actually go and say, well, we haven't had any devices that have been compromised. Again, medical devices are built to last. This means legacy will always be a problem. Hardware will at some point not be able to support software and firmware updates. So you will always deal with legacy devices. There's no way to get around it. This is the reason that this is often targeted, because we know that there's a legacy problem. At some point, as uncomfortable as this is, all devices will be vulnerable once in their lifetime. It's inevitable, and we should log accordingly. But what makes it harder? Security and forensics is not a one-size-fits-all. There isn't just one solution for all. It depends on the device, and it largely depends on what the device's use case is. With that, hopefully, I haven't used all my time, and I want to do a special word of thanks, specifically to the Medtronic CRM team that has put up with me for many years, asking, poking, prodding, wanting to feed my patient curiosities and understand that from a DFIR perspective, for allowing me to work with them, integrate with them, and go with them on this journey. Specifically, I want to say thank you to Carl Erickson and team. Every developer that has loved logs absolutely as hard as I have. Logs are now my favorite thing. The university I work at that sometimes supports, that always supports my crazy research. The Biohack Village, as well as eBay, should have an honorable mention for having a marketplace I can obtain devices from. And with that, if you have any questions, reach out to me. But there will be future work in terms of actually scaling this to larger organizations, the architecture for the SIEM, a logging by design process, which I have already about 60% done, a known sensitive data analytics tool, which is also in the pipeline, and a medical device incident response plan. Thank you for listening to me. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out.